It all began with what I initially thought was a fleeting, harmless infatuation, something so minor that I never imagined it would affect me the way it did. I have always found myself intrigued by military men. There's an allure about them that I can't quite explain. Perhaps it's the discipline, the unwavering courage, or the air of confidence they exude, walking with heads held high, as though no challenge or hardship in the world could possibly unsettle them. It's more than just their appearance, their crisp, neatly pressed uniforms, their powerful stride. Their very presence seems to command attention. Every time I encountered one, I couldn't help but feel drawn to their aura, daydreaming about their heroism and imagining the untold stories they might carry from the fields they fought on. Among them was Kelvin, the son of my closest friend, Patricia. He wasn't just any soldier. Kelvin had an undeniable charisma that set him apart from others. Standing tall, with broad shoulders and a build that seemed carved from stone, his presence alone demanded respect. His strength was apparent, not just in his muscular frame, but in the way he moved, graceful, yet undeniably powerful. Every step he took felt as though he owned the very ground beneath his feet. Yet, despite this commanding presence, there was nothing boastful or arrogant about him. He exuded a calm, almost stoic demeanor, like a man who had seen much of the world but chose to keep his thoughts and emotions contained, only revealing glimpses of what lay beneath the surface. First, I didn't realize how much I had started noticing him. I simply appreciated his character, admiring him from a distance as I always did with military men. But as time went on, I began looking forward to every opportunity one had to visit Patricia, hoping I might catch a glimpse of Kelvin. Sometimes, he would be there, seated quietly in the corner of the room, his attention absorbed in a book or perhaps sipping tea, his military uniform subtly hinting at the life he led outside the walls of Patricia's home. In the beginning, I dismissed it as nothing more than admiration for someone who embodied all the qualities I had always respected: bravery, self-discipline, and honor. But gradually, I began to notice myself stealing glances at him more frequently, each look sending an unexpected thrill through me. I would observe the way his sleeves clung to his well-defined arms, the way his voice carried an undeniable authority even in casual conversations, and the way his smile, gentle yet reserved, seemed to be something personal, like an unspoken secret shared only between us. I couldn't help but feel guilty for the emotions stirring within me. After all, Kelvin was much younger than I was, and even more importantly, he was the son of my closest friend. It was a boundary I knew I should never cross. Yet my heart didn't seem to care about such logic. Whenever he was near, I felt an undeniable pull, a strange excitement that felt almost forbidden. It was like standing too close to something dangerous, something I was not meant to touch, and yet, despite knowing it was wrong, I couldn't stop myself. Kelvin had recently joined the army, and somehow, since that time, he had become even more captivating. Every visit to Patricia's house seemed to intensify the attraction I felt for him. He would walk in, his uniform perfectly pressed, his boots shining with precision, and his presence filling the room, commanding attention without uttering a single word. I tried to convince myself that this wasn't anything more than a deep respect for a young man who had chosen such a noble path. After all, I had always held the military in high regard, and Kelvin embodied everything I admired about it: strength, discipline, sacrifice. But as much as I tried to brush it off, something about him made my heart race in ways I could never explain. It was in the subtle way his voice resonated with confidence, even when he was talking about something as mundane as the weather or his day-to-day life. It was in the way his smile seemed warm, yet there was an underlying reserve, like he was holding back parts of himself, only offering what he deemed necessary. And it was in the way he looked at me, those brief moments when our gazes would meet, and for a fleeting second, I would be caught in a storm of emotions, unsure of what to say or do next. I constantly reminded myself of the many reasons why I shouldn't feel this way, why I should just admire him from afar and keep my distance. After all, I was older than him, much older, and I had lived through many experiences that had shaped the person I was. I was someone who had made my fair share of mistakes and learned the hard way. And, above all, I was Patricia's best friend, someone she trusted, and I owed it to her to respect the boundaries of our relationship. But despite all my attempts at reasoning, my heart didn't listen. Every time Kelvin was around, my resolve seemed to weaken a little more. I found myself drawn to him, not just because of the uniform or the pride I felt for him as a member of the military, but because of the quiet strength he seemed to carry within himself. It was as if he had experienced things in his young life that most people would never even dream of. And it was that silent resilience that captivated me the most. It was a rainy day when everything changed. The rain fell in sheets, drumming against the roof with a rhythm that seemed to echo the growing unrest in my chest. The sky was thick with dark, ominous clouds, casting an eerie gloom over everything. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a constant reminder of the storm's power, and the air smelled fresh, with the earthy scent of wet soil wafting in from outside. I had come to Patricia's house that day, intending to drop off a bag of groceries as a simple favor. It was meant to be a quick visit, just a drop-off, perhaps a cup of tea if she was around, and then I'd be on my way. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just the usual warmth of Patricia's home and a friendly chat before I left. But when I arrived, Patricia wasn't there. She had gone to the market, probably rushing through the rain to finish her errands. I wasn't surprised. Patricia had always been the type to handle everything with grace, no matter the circumstances. I entered, shaking the rain off my umbrella, and called out to let her know I had arrived. But instead of Patricia's voice, I heard Kelvin's. His deep, calm voice came from the living room, smooth yet undeniably present. "I'm here," he said, stepping into view. I froze for a moment, surprised to see him. Kelvin had just returned from his base, and his sudden presence caught me off guard. He was dressed casually, but there was an undeniable way he carried himself. His posture, his demeanor, all of it screamed military discipline. It was as if he was always on, always aware of his surroundings. "Patricia went to the market," he said, offering a small but genuine smile as he stepped toward me. "You can leave the groceries here. She should be back soon." I nodded, placing the bag on the kitchen counter, but my heart was racing. The room felt smaller now, with Kelvin in it, his very presence filling the space. I tried to steady myself, to focus on the task at hand, but it was impossible to ignore the effect he had on me. "I didn't expect you to be home," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed the nervous energy building within me. "It's my day off," he replied, leaning effortlessly against the doorway. "Figured I'd spend it here before heading back." Outside, the rain intensified, the thunder closer now, and I found myself looking out the window, almost mesmerized by the storm. It was as though the world outside was pressing us to stay inside, forcing us into this moment together. I told myself to focus on anything but him, on the groceries, on the storm, on anything to distract myself, but the energy between us was palpable. I didn't know it then, but that moment, with the rain and the unspoken tension hanging between us, would change everything. His strong frame sank into the cushions as he leaned back, the weight of his body pressing deeply into the soft fabric. There was a heaviness to his posture, the kind that comes with months of relentless training, a kind of fatigue that only those who have pushed their limits time and time again can truly understand. He looked worn out, but it was the kind of exhaustion that spoke volumes about his dedication. I observed him quietly, unsure of how to approach the silence between us. His face was serene, yet the faint lines around his eyes told a different story. A story of sleepless nights, grueling exercises, and battles fought not just with the body, but with the mind. His uniform, casual now but once crisp and authoritative, still carried an air of discipline that I could almost feel in the room. It was clear that the life he led had carved him into someone strong, resolute, and capable. But in this moment, he seemed at peace, as if this quiet corner of home offered him a rare refuge. After a few moments of contemplation, I finally spoke, my voice cutting through the hum of the rain outside. "How is the military training going?" I asked, not quite knowing what else to say. My words felt small against the backdrop of the relentless downpour. He opened his eyes slowly, meeting my gaze with a steady look. A faint nod followed as he exhaled deeply, the weariness in his voice palpable. "It's been a long week," he said, his tone low but deliberate. "The training has been intense. They push us hard. But that's the point." His words were measured, and there was an undercurrent of both pride and exhaustion that I couldn't quite ignore. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should say more, then decided to step closer and take a seat on the couch across from him. I kept my distance, partly out of respect, and partly because the tension in the room made me uneasy. "What kind of training?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. I genuinely wanted to understand the demands of his life, what it was like to endure that kind of mental and physical strain day after day. Kelvin shifted slightly, propping himself up with his elbows on his knees. His posture straightened a little as he leaned forward, as if the topic itself gave him a burst of energy. "Physical drills, tactical exercises, mental endurance tests, everything you can imagine," he explained. "They're preparing us for anything. It's all about adaptability. No matter what situation we're thrown into, we need to be ready." A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "It's tough, but I love it. It's what I've always wanted." His words were filled with a passion that began to shine through his exhaustion, and I found myself drawn into the rhythm of his speech. There was something undeniably magnetic about the way he spoke. He didn't just talk about his training, he talked about his purpose, his sense of duty. It was clear that this path, this life, was something he had chosen, something that mattered to him on a deep, personal level. As he continued, his tone shifted slightly, becoming more animated. He shared stories of his comrades, the bond they shared, and the pride he felt in wearing the uniform. The exhaustion was still there, visible in the way his shoulders sagged slightly, but there was a certain light in his eyes, a fire that was impossible to ignore. As he spoke, I began to see a side of him I hadn't noticed before. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a young man, full of dreams, struggles, and a burning desire to make a difference. His words were filled with a kind of raw honesty, and I found myself captivated by them, by him. He mentioned moments when he missed home, the smell of his mother's cooking, the comfort of a quiet evening, the simple joys of life that so often went unnoticed. As he spoke about these things, the vulnerability in his voice was unmistakable. It was a stark contrast to the tough exterior he usually presented. I hadn't realized how much of him I had yet to see. The more he spoke, the more human he seemed to me, like someone trying to balance the demands of duty with the warmth of his own desires and emotions. "You must be proud of yourself," I said softly, the admiration in my voice slipping through despite my best efforts to keep it neutral. Kelvin shrugged, a modest gesture that conveyed more humility than I had expected. "I'm just doing what I love," he said, his tone casual but sincere. In that moment, a wave of admiration washed over me. There was something about him, a quiet strength, a determination that was so palpable, yet tempered by the kind of humility that only comes from someone who is truly dedicated to their craft. The storm outside seemed to magnify this feeling, as if the whole world had receded, leaving us in this fragile moment together. The rain continued to fall in torrents, the sound of it deafening as it hammered against the roof and windows. The sky outside had turned a dark, oppressive gray, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the room for a brief second before the thunder rumbled across the distance. The storm seemed endless, as if nature itself was mirroring the chaos and uncertainty that I could feel growing inside me. I had been pacing back and forth, my thoughts scattered, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Patricia calling. Her voice crackled through the speaker, the sounds of a bustling market and heavy rain drowning out her words at times. "I'm stuck here," she explained apologetically. "The rain's too heavy, and I can't find a cab. It's going to be a while before I can make it back. Could you stay at the house for a bit and keep Kelvin company for me?" I glanced over at Kelvin, who hadn't noticed me staring. He was still sitting comfortably, scrolling through his phone with a casual air that seemed almost at odds with the tension building inside me. After a brief pause, I agreed, forcing a casual tone. Of course. Take your time and stay safe. When the call ended, I turned to Kelvin, offering a small smile. Looks like it's just the two of us for a while, I said, trying to keep things light. He looked up at me, a faint grin playing at the edges of his mouth. Guess so, he replied, his voice warm and relaxed. As if nothing was out of the ordinary, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The storm outside raged on, but the quiet between us became almost suffocating. I could feel my heart rate quicken, though I didn't understand why. It was just Kelvin, Patricia's son, my best friend's son, but something about the intimacy of the moment, combined with the storm's relentless fury, made the house feel smaller, more enclosed. You can sit. You know, Kelvin said, his eyes lifting to meet mine briefly before gesturing to the space next to him. No need to stand around. I laughed nervously, waving a hand dismissively. I'm fine over here, I said, but my legs felt heavy, and the thought of sitting closer to him unnerved me. After a moment of hesitation, I finally gave in, taking a seat on the armchair across from him. We sat in silence for a while, the sound of the rain almost drowning out the space between us. Kelvin stretched his arms above his head, his shirt lifting slightly to reveal a glimpse of his toned stomach. I quickly averted my eyes, feeling embarrassed for having noticed. But the image lingered in my mind longer than I wanted it to. Rain like this makes you just want to stay in bed all day, he said, breaking the silence and offering a small chuckle. I responded with a light laugh of my own. Or curl up with a good book, I added, grateful for the distraction. He nodded, a thoughtful look crossing his face before he spoke again. I haven't had much time to relax lately, he admitted. Training keeps me busy. The conversation was light and easy, but there was something deeper in the way he spoke, a vulnerability that he didn't often show. The storm outside created a kind of intimacy between us, a sense that the world beyond those walls had faded away, leaving only the two of us in this small, quiet corner of the house. Feeling the need to occupy myself, I walked to the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly as I unpacked the groceries Patricia had asked me to bring. I arranged the items methodically on the counter, trying to focus on the simple task at hand. The storm raged on outside, but the real turmoil was inside me. I could feel the tension in my chest, the rush of emotions, anticipation, guilt, and something far more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to desire. I wiped my hands on the towel, focusing intently on the rhythmic motions of preparing dinner. The familiarity of the task should have been comforting. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept wandering back to Kelvin. It was as though he had an invisible pull on me, an undeniable force that seemed to draw my thoughts to him time and time again. His presence in the house felt like a subtle yet magnetic energy, quietly demanding my attention. Do you need help with anything? His voice drifted from the living room, smooth and calm, yet underlaid with a warmth that made my stomach flutter. The tone was unassuming, yet there was an edge to it that I couldn't quite define, something that made my heart beat a little faster. I cleared my throat, attempting to steady the erratic rhythm of my pulse. No, I'm fine, I answered, my voice more strained than I intended. The words felt hollow, a stark contrast to the chaos bubbling just beneath the surface. My hands trembled as I reached for a pot, and the sound of it clattering onto the counter echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet kitchen, a sharp reminder of how flustered I had become. Seconds later, I felt him before I saw him. Kelvin's presence filled the doorway, his tall frame leaning casually against the doorframe. The dim light above cast soft shadows over his strong, angular features, emphasizing his striking presence. It was as if the room itself shifted to make space for him, his figure almost dominating the space. Are you sure? He asked, a playful smile tugging at the corners of his lips, though his eyes held a deeper curiosity. You look like you could use a hand. I turned to face him, gripping the towel like it was my anchor, something to keep me grounded in a moment that was rapidly spiraling beyond my control. When our gazes locked, my breath caught in my throat. For a brief instant, time seemed to stop. The faint sound of the rain outside became a distant hum, drowned out by the rapid thumping of my heartbeat. His eyes were steady, focused, searching, as though he was trying to understand something that even he couldn't fully articulate. There was a depth to his gaze that made me feel exposed, as though he could see into the very core of me, reading the thoughts that flickered across my mind. "I'm fine," I whispered, my voice barely audible, my mind screaming for some semblance of control. But Kelvin didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between us in a way that felt intentional yet effortless. His presence was all-encompassing, filling the small kitchen with a warmth that seemed to reach out and pull me toward him. The air around us felt charged, heavy with an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his voice softer now, almost teasing, though there was something more in it, something like a question that didn't need to be answered. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died on my tongue. Instead, we stood there, staring at each other, the air thick with emotions we were both too afraid to name. It was as if we were caught in a suspended moment, where every word, every breath, was amplified 100-fold. "Kelvin," I began, my voice trembling, but the rest of the sentence never came. The weight of the situation felt too much to bear, and the words tangled in my throat. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently, his voice barely a murmur. His eyes searched mine with a tenderness that made my heart race. It was as though he was trying to understand what neither of us could quite explain. But he was patient, waiting for me to find the courage to speak. Before I could react, his hand reached up, brushing against my cheek with a tenderness that sent a shiver down my spine. The warmth of his touch contrasted with the roughness of his hands, callous from years of physical labor. And yet, despite the roughness, there was a gentleness in his touch that made my heart skip a beat. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to pull away, to put an end to the dangerous game we were playing. But my body remained rooted in place, unable to move. I knew it was wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong, but as I stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, with the rain beating softly against the windows, Kelvin's presence was all-consuming. It was as if, in that moment, nothing else in the world mattered except the electricity that crackled between us. Then, his lips met mine. The moment was electric, a quiet explosion that made everything else fade into oblivion. The sound of the rain against the windows, the distant rumble of thunder, everything disappeared, leaving only the sensation of his lips on mine. The kiss was hesitant at first, gentle, as though he was seeking permission, unsure if I would reciprocate. I froze, a rush of conflicting emotions surging through me. Guilt, excitement, fear. It was all too much. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull back, but my heart, my body, responded before I could even process what was happening. The hesitation that had marked the beginning of the kiss melted away, replaced by a slow, deepening intensity. His hands moved to cup my face, drawing me closer, as though he was afraid I would disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. I leaned into him, unable to resist, the pull between us too strong to ignore. All the feelings I had buried for so long, all the thoughts I had convinced myself were fleeting, came rushing to the surface. For years, I had convinced myself that my feelings for Kelvin were nothing more than harmless admiration, a fleeting infatuation. But standing there, with him holding me, kissing me, I realized just how wrong I had been. This wasn't some passing fancy. It was something far deeper, something that had been waiting to erupt, buried beneath layers of denial. As the kiss deepened, my heart raced in my chest. The emotions swirling within me were overwhelming: guilt, excitement, longing, and a yearning that I couldn't even name. There was a voice inside my head screaming for me to stop, to end it all before it went too far. But another part of me, the louder part, told me that this was what I had wanted all along. I pulled back slightly, meeting his gaze. His eyes mirrored my own emotions: uncertainty, longing, desire. We stood there, breathing heavily, the storm outside echoing the chaos that raged inside me. It was as if the storm outside reflected the tempest in my soul, a turbulent mix of passion and fear, excitement and guilt. Without a word, I reached for his hand, my fingers trembling as they closed around his. He didn't pull away, instead squeezing my hand gently, as if to reassure me that I wasn't alone in this. I led him down the hallway, each step toward the bedroom feeling like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest, the noise of it deafening as I focused on nothing but the path ahead. The room was dim, the curtains drawn tightly against the flashing lightning outside. The steady hum of the rain created an almost surreal calm amidst the storm. When I turned to face Kelvin, we just stood there for a moment, our gazes locked in a silent conversation, both of us searching for something: comfort, understanding, connection. "I've always had a crush on you," I whispered, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. My cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but I didn't look away. I wanted him to know the truth, to understand that this wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. This had been building for years. He smiled softly, a small, almost shy smile. "I didn't know," he murmured, "but I'm glad you told me." His words eased some of the tension in the room, but the air between us still vibrated with the intensity of the moment. I stepped closer to him, my hand resting against his chest. I could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath my palm, a rhythm that grounded me in the midst of the chaos. As the storm raged on outside, we let ourselves get lost in the quiet storm of emotions swirling between us, each one threatening to pull us under. For that one night, nothing else mattered, not the consequences, not the guilt, not the reality waiting for us when the morning came. In that moment, all that existed was the two of us, standing together in the silence, letting go of everything that had held us back for so long. What had happened weighed on me, settling over my mind like a thick, suffocating blanket that I couldn't shake off. The warmth, the intensity, and the fleeting sense of connection from that moment had all evaporated, leaving behind a cold emptiness that gnawed at my insides. It was a silence that felt deafening, as though the world around me had faded into the background, and all that remained was the profound weight of what I had done. For what felt like an eternity, I remained still, not speaking a word. I lay there beside him, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and guilt. I couldn't make sense of what had just transpired. This wasn't just a fleeting mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a betrayal of my best friend's trust, an act that had crossed a line I knew I should never have crossed. And yet, despite the overwhelming guilt that churned inside me, there was something else stirring deep within, a sensation I couldn't ignore, a quiet and undeniable yearning that I hadn't been able to fully face until now. It was a mix of feelings that both scared and intrigued me, something I had suppressed for so long but could no longer deny. The attraction I had always felt, the feelings I had buried so deep within myself, had finally surfaced in a way I had never anticipated. As I glanced over at Kelvin, I saw him lying there, his eyes closed in peaceful slumber. His chest rose and fell steadily, each breath a reminder of the calmness that contrasted sharply with the storm raging within me. In that moment, I realized that while guilt and shame weighed heavily on my conscience, there was also something else, a spark, a hunger for more. I couldn't ignore the truth that now burned brightly in my chest. I wanted more. I craved more of the connection we had shared, more of the intimacy and closeness I had never allowed myself to experience before. It was a terrifying realization because I knew that there would be no easy way back from this. A part of me longed to forget the consequences, to ignore the complexity of what we had done and simply indulge in this newfound closeness. But I knew that was unrealistic. The reality of the situation was far more complicated, and there was no way to undo what had already happened. I had crossed a line, one that once crossed, could never be erased. Yet, despite knowing the gravity of the situation, there was a small, irrational part of me, the part that had always secretly wanted him, that didn't want this to end. I wanted more. More of the moments we had shared. More of his touch. More of the connection that had felt so real and intense in that fleeting instant. And that part of me was terrified, because I had no idea how to control these feelings, how to stop the desire from growing even more. It felt like a fire had been ignited inside of me, and now, no matter how much I tried to suppress it, The flames only seemed to grow hotter. The rain continued to pour outside, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to mirror the chaos in my mind. I couldn't help but wonder what would come next. What did this mean for us? Would things ever go back to the way they were before? Could they even go back to normal? Or had this moment, this single, irreversible event, changed everything forever? The uncertainty gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that life as I knew it would never be the same again. Days passed, and on the surface, life continued as usual. We went through our routines as if nothing had changed. Kelvin still visited his mother's house on the weekends, and I would continue visiting Patricia, keeping up the pretense that nothing had happened between us. We were like actors playing our parts in a story that had taken an unexpected turn, carefully keeping up appearances for the sake of the world around us. To the outside world, everything seemed as it always had been. But within me, within the depths of my soul, everything felt different. It was as though the world had shifted on its axis, and I was standing on unstable ground, struggling to regain my balance. We kept our secret locked away, buried deep within the corners of our minds. The guilt would occasionally resurface, making me feel uneasy whenever I saw Kelvin, but it was always quickly masked by a forced smile or a casual conversation. It was as though we had built an invisible wall between us, one that kept our secret hidden away where it wouldn't be seen or acknowledged. But no matter how hard I tried to push the memories of that night away, they refused to leave. Every time I saw him, I couldn't help but remember the closeness we had shared, the warmth of his touch, the intensity in his eyes, the way we had connected in a way that I had never imagined possible. It was impossible to forget, impossible to pretend like nothing had changed. And yet, I told myself that it had to remain this way. It had to stay buried in the depths of our hearts, a secret we could never speak of, a truth that no one else could ever discover. Living with such a heavy truth between us felt strange, almost suffocating. We had become masters of pretense, pretending that things were unchanged, pretending that nothing had shifted between us. But deep down, I could feel the tension every time we were alone together. There was an unspoken force between us, a magnetic pull that neither of us could ignore. The desire, the longing, was still there, just beneath the surface, making it difficult to keep our distance. Yet, for the sake of our friendship, for Patricia's sake, we both knew we had to keep our secret locked away. It was a delicate balance, living with this truth that neither of us could voice, constantly on edge, never quite knowing when it might surface again. Our lives went on as though nothing had happened, but in the deepest corners of my mind, I knew everything had changed. It was only a matter of time before the reality of what we had done would catch up with us. What would happen then? Would we be able to keep pretending? Or would the consequences of that night eventually force us to face the truth we had so desperately tried to bury? Thank you for taking the time to watch our videos. If you find the content useful and interesting, don't forget to like, share, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Our channel will always update attractive, inspiring, and useful content for you. Click the bell icon to receive notifications as soon as there are new videos. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue to develop. Thank you and see you in the next videos.